Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today's a little different from usual because I'm not going to be interviewing anybody and I'm not even going to be chairing a conversation among experts. Instead, I get to listen and watch, as you do, to a real lecture, which we rarely do. But it's a treat because the lecturer in this case is Professor Walter Dorn, whom I've known for many years, and who's a specialist in peacekeeping. He is a professor at the Royal Military College and in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And he is also a professor at probably more of the time at the Canadian Forces College here in Toronto, where he teaches military officers. Um, Oftentimes including classes with foreign visiting military, high-level military officers who maybe are on a sabbatical or take a break and get refresher courses or new insights. So Walter can certainly impart a lot of new insights. He has worked for many years creating new technological innovations for the United Nations to use in surveillance activities. But I think his main claim to fame is that he is a real expert on Canadian peacekeeping. Now, in this case, he was giving a lecture by video to the Calgary Plowshares Group, a wonderful organization of people who are interested in preventing war. And peacekeeping is a great way of preventing war. One of the good interventions and innovations that have been developed in the last few decades. So I'm going to turn the meeting now over to my friends in Calgary. So come in, Calgary.
Happy to have the chance to introduce Dr. Walter Dorn, who is going to speak to us about what UN peacekeeping could contribute to Canadian security. This is the fifth in a series of talks we've had about the defense of Canada, and I think it's a really important and fascinating and forward-looking perspective. Has a book entitled Keeping Watch, and I gather he's talking about the prospect of another book. Now, Professor Dorn spoke to our group before. It was 2 or 3 years ago. I remember the occasion fondly, and he very generously has offered to speak to us again. Even though I warned him that it might be a small group, he was really keen to come, and we're keen to hear him as well. So, welcome, Walter, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Trudy, and all my friends. I I really feel when I'm in this group with people who love peace and want to make the world a better place that I am in common company. And I'm really eager to share with you some ideas about how peacekeeping could be useful in the world today. I think that one of the big lessons that we can learn from history is how useful peacekeeping can be, and it's one of the untold lessons that we don't hear of because the media puts all on the negative. But I want to start off on the very big picture today. So I'm going to show you a picture of our home. This is planet Earth. So we're all fellow citizens of this wonderful, amazing planet, which is filled with an abundance of life. It's an amazing ball flying through space with a very thin atmosphere. It's less than 1% of the diameter of the Earth. And if you think that its process of the evolution of life and eventually human beings coming here, maybe 5 billion-year-old planet, 250,000 years of human beings, and you think about the progress that's been made in many fashions, including technological. We saw the Artemis 2 spacecraft going into the other side of the moon, the dark side of the moon, and coming back and taking similarly beautiful pictures of the Earth. This one is called Blue Marble. It's from the 1972 Apollo 17. And it just gives an idea of that this is one planet. There's no dotted lines for countries. It's all interconnected. And if I had one line to answer to the question of Canadian security, it's that Canadian security is global security. And I'm reminded of a saying by Louis Saint Laurent when he was Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada after the Second World War. He said the UN's vocation is Canada's vocation. And so we can really try to see ways that can apply on a global basis. But global thinking is really at the heart of being able to solve the problems today, because the problems that we have in the world today are global problems. So if you think about cyberspace and cyber attacks, it's a global commons. Think about the oceans and waterways, including the Strait of Hormuz. These are global passages. We're seeing how interconnected we are economically through the price of oil, but in so many other ways we're interconnected. Even this picture shows you how the clouds don't make distinction between countries. They move freely in the atmosphere. We breathe the same air, and we're reaping the results of industrialization in different parts of the world because the air just moves freely. It's transboundary, it's transnational, and it's global. So we just realizing that interconnectedness would have quite a different view that humanity would have of itself, and rather than being based on narrow-minded nationalism, it would be based on broad-minded globalism. So today I'm going to talk about UN peacekeeping and Canadian security with the broad perspective of history. You can see from my introduction that I like the big picture, whether it be our planet Earth flying through space, or it be the history of Homo sapiens as a species on Earth. We can really learn lessons from history, and I'm going to focus on lessons in the last 100 years or 150 years. So we had World War I, which resulted in a major cataclysm. There was a kind of pride that humanity had been able to create empires and civilization was expanding, but it all came crashing down when the European powers, who were the imperial powers, experienced a war between themselves. So France and Germany and UK and other great powers getting involved in what I call the expansion of this from the shot that rang around the world in Sarajevo. And it just showed how interconnected we were already in 1914, when the killing of one man in Sarajevo sparked a world war. And despite the correspondence between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, it even expanded into Russia too. I call it the Willie-Nicky correspondence, because the two were cousins, and they tried to stop the war, but the military machines were already so primed, and the web of secret treaties forced the nations into going to war, and pretty soon they were in a war that they all regretted. So one of the results of that war was a better awareness that we need to have institutions that can stop nationalism in its narrowest and most violent form from spreading and from causing these wars. So out of the ashes of World War I came the League of Nations, which was built in Geneva, the headquarters there. And it was a first step towards creating a world organization that could manage our global problems. And it had beginnings of a decolonization effort through the mandate system. It started to promote human rights. It actually had a provision in the League Covenant that there would be equal opportunity for employment in the League for men and women alike. The main principle of the League was adopted from the 14 points of President Woodrow Wilson, who declared it as a war aim of the United States in World War I. And that point is that a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants in order to guarantee the territorial integrity and political independence of small and great nations alike. So there you have the guarantee of political independence and territorial integrity. Those words were put into the League Covenant. They carried over into Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and they are fundamental to a vision for a better world where nations, whether they're big or small, don't interfere in political matters, and they respect the territorial integrity of other countries. But of course, that great vision did not come to fruition through the League, although many steps were made in that direction. And there were very noble efforts, including the World Disarmament Conference of 1932. But the powers that be didn't want to accommodate Germany early enough, and the Klarno process was ground to a halt. And by that time, Hitler had been elected in 1933, and he wanted to go to war. And so the League was really not able to deal with the escalation of fascism in the 1930s, although it had a remarkable series of successes in the 1920s in preventing conflicts and wars. But in the 1930s, it was really powerless because nations did not want to give the League of Nations the powers that were required. I'll give you one example because I'm going to weave Canada into this picture through the history. We joined the League of Nations. We had problems with Article 10 and with some of the commitments in there. We'd just been involved. We were automatically at war when Great Britain was at war in August of 1914. And we saw this as being a commitment that might involve us in future wars because we would have to come to the aid of a country that was attacked under the collective security provisions of the League of Nations Covenant. And so Senator Rel Dandurand made a famous statement around 1928 when he said that we in Canada live in a fireproof house, far from any inflammable materials. So in this mutual association of fire insurance, not all member states have the same responsibilities. So this was the idea that somehow that Canada, we had two oceans, now we only say three oceans, to protect us from threats, and we've been very able to live very peacefully since the War of 1812. We haven't had aggression on our soil, but there was a sense in joining the League that this was something that needed to be done as a result of World War I, and that the world's problems were Canadian problems, but a very great reluctance. So when Walter Adele Dixon, the ambassador in Geneva in 1935, saw that Mussolini was conquering Abyssinia and using chemical weapons to subdue the population, then he proposed oil sanctions on Mussolini's forces. And it was gaining momentum in the League of Nations. But our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, went to Geneva and discounted these sanctions and said Canada would no longer support them. So we saw a lack of support for Abyssinia, which is now modern-day Ethiopia. And Emperor Haile Selassie had gone to this building, the League of Nations, and said to the League that you have to come to our aid. He said, his quote, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." So the idea that the security was interconnected, and by aiding a country that was being attacked, that we would actually be protecting our own security, that wasn't the view in the League of Nations from many countries, and there was no willingness to take on a major power like Italy. But the World War II came, and we were at war about a week after Great Britain. This time we actually had a vote in Parliament for whether we would join or not. It wasn't automatic like it was in World War I. And when one of our dear colleagues, the late George Ignatieff, was on the rooftop of Canada House in London, England, with Lester Pearson, they were thinking about how could you create a world that would be better afterwards, and what could Canada do? So they were already thinking during the war about a post-war World War order. And the nations of the world saw the United Nations as being an evolution from the League of Nations. Instead of a League Assembly, there was a General Assembly. Instead of a League Council, there was a Security Council. Instead of, there was still a Secretary General. That tradition continued on from the League to the UN. And there was added a Trusteeship Council, in order to take over from the Mandates Commission, and very much stronger emphasis on human rights and more enforcement power. That was the main view, that the United Nations would have enforcement powers that the League never had. So we had an international organization. It was deliberately placed in New York because the United States had not been a member of the League of Nations. It had proposed the League of Nations. It had championed its creation in Paris Peace Conference of 1919, but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee refused to ratify it without reservations. And President Woodrow Wilson said that ratifying with reservations is equivalent to nullification of the treaty, because if the United States gave itself the ability to change its commitments that it had signed in Paris, then every other nation, including Germany, would be able to do similarly, and we would not be able to have a League of Nations at all, because it would actually mean nothing when all the nations put in their own reservation. By the way, one of those reservations back in 1919 was that Canada would not have a vote in the League of Nations Council, and Canada had already secured from the three main leaders in Paris, that's Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, and Woodrow Wilson, that Canada would have its own seat on the League of Nations Council. And that's one of the fundamental documents for the founding of Canada's own foreign policy, was this ability to have its own voice. If you look at the documents on external relations, that the series that Global Affairs publishes about its own history, you'll see that that document is actually copied and placed with the signatures right on it in the volume, I think it's volume 2 of the Foreign External Relations. Now, during the Cold War, there were many times when the Security Council was paralyzed, and the UN did come up with some quasi-solutions like the Uniting for Peace resolution. And when France and UK vetoed a Security Council resolution to deal with their invasion, along with Israel, of Egypt in 1956, and their grab of the Suez Canal, the General Assembly was invoked, and under Uniting for Peace, it could take an issue that was deadlocked in the Security Council. And at that key moment, Pearson made a proposal that the United Nations forces would take over from the British and French forces in Egypt, and that their role would be to turn over to the Egyptians the territory and help take out the sunken ships in the Suez Canal, and oversee the negotiations for the withdrawal of Israeli forces. And this is a picture that was given to Lester Pearson. It was also shown to me by Lester Pearson's son, Jeffrey Pearson, which Dag Hammarskjöld signed for Lester Pearson. And it states, "To be or not to be for the UN force. With deep gratitude, Dag Hammarskjöld." So at this conversation, Lester Pearson is convincing Dag Hammarskjöld that we should do something new in world organization. We should create an international force, a UN force, that is responsible to the UN Secretary General. And Hammarskjöld wasn't sure that he could take those responsibilities and what would it entail. But once he adopted the idea, then he went forward with brilliant plans. He wrote great plans for the creation of that UN emergency force that Pearson had proposed. And Canada, in its proposal in November 1956, said that Canada would be happy to contribute forces to this new UN emergency force. So that was the beginning of UN peacekeeping forces. We had UN missions, that is, observer missions before, but those were unarmed forces. These were unarmed missions and unarmed military observers. This was the first time that we had a force that is composed with soldiers who could protect themselves if they were fired at. They could work in war zones, and they could actually hold territory if they were challenged. So a major development that the world finally saw, that they could put international force under UN operational control. In my military area, we don't say under UN command, because the actual designation is operational control, or OPCON, which the Secretary General has to this day. Secretary General to this day has responsibility for more military forces under OPCON than anybody else except those nations which are at war today. So that I should say in missions abroad, the Secretary General has more, except for those countries which have forces engaged in war. That's the United States and Russia and Ukraine. But that's around 60,000 armed personnel as a result of this Canadian proposal in 1956. Now, Pearson proposed a number of forces to come that could be provided, and also offered General E.L.M. Burns, known as Tommy Burns, with the responsibility to organize the force. And he had already been in the Middle East. He was, at the time, the chief of staff of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, which exists to this day. And General Burns organized that first force. Pearson wanted to have Canadian forces, military forces there, but Nasser, the president of Egypt, thought that the Canadian flag looked too much like the British flag with the ensign on it, and said that his soldiers might mistake the Canadian soldiers for British soldiers. And Pearson got the idea that we have to change our flag. And of course, when he became prime minister, we did change our flag, and we got the wonderful flag that we have to this day. So you'll see here Dag Hammarskjöld inspecting the troops. You have General Burns back here, and also an Indian who subsequently became the force commander, but at this point he was chief of staff, Inderjit Ricky. And this is a force that played a major role in resolving the Suez crisis. The UN also had a role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was a major role in resolving the Suez crisis in 1956. And each day when I go into work, I pass this plaque, which was given by the graduating class of 99, with a list of those Canadians who died in peace operations. And indeed, the hall that I go through is called Burns Hall, where we have our syndicate rooms, where we meet in smaller groups with students. And you'll see the list of those who died, including under UNEF, there's a fair number of names, UN Emergency Force, which is the one that Pearson had created. So still, there's a tradition in the Canadian Forces and in Canada in general. As a result of his work, Pearson won the 1957 Nobel Peace Prize for finding a solution to the Suez crisis, and he also for founding the first UN peacekeeping force. In 1988, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to those peacekeepers who had served in UN missions until that time, and at that point, 10% of all UN forces were Canadian. So many Canadian soldiers, some 80,000, received the Nobel Peace Prize because it was given to peacekeepers. They didn't get any of the money though, but they got some of the honor. And in '92, we did a statue in Ottawa called Reconciliation near the National Art Museum, and we have there pictures of UN peacekeepers and Canadian soldiers who are observers, communicators, and standing guard as they would in a peacekeeping operation. 1994 saw the creation of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. Unfortunately, that center was disbanded in 2013, but it did serve many generations of soldiers, and I still have people who recall fondly the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. In fact, I was at a conference in Vicenza, Italy last November, and they were recalling the first meeting of the International Association of Peacekeeping Training Centers, IAPTC, which was held at the Pearson Peacekeeping Center, I think 1996. And that organization is still going strong, even if the Canadian version, the Canadian original center is closed. The Peace Support Training Center in Kingston trains military officers, whereas the Pearson Peacekeeping Center trains civilians and military and police all together as integrated training. In the PSTC, there's training of military personnel for deployment on peace operations. We deploy currently so few Canadian soldiers on peacekeeping that almost all the entire class there is of international officers who come and take courses here in Canada. Glad to say that the Reconciliation Monument made the back of the Loonie in 1995, and that a special medal was given to those who served more than 30 days in peacekeeping operations. It's called the Peacekeeping Service Medal, PKSM. And soldiers wear it proudly on their uniforms, those who have served. But there's fewer and fewer who can wear that medal now because we have so few contributions to peacekeeping. We've only had one deployment of troops since 2002, and that was only for 6 months. And we had an Air Force component in 2018 for 2 rotations, would be 1 year. And but apart from that, there's just there's no opportunities for units to deploy on peacekeeping. The 2001, we had the back of the $10 bill, which had a banner that said "Au service de la paix" in small writing, with a woman, blue beret peacekeeper, looking through binoculars, as well as the cenotaph in Ottawa and words from John McCrae's in Flanders Fields. Two of our most famous generals were Lou Mackenzie, who managed to get a ceasefire in Sarajevo, and Romeo Dallaire, who managed to save 20 to 30,000 lives in the midst of a genocide in Rwanda in 1994. So he wrote a great book about his experiences, Shake Hands with the Devil, and also there's a great film as well as a documentary, all called the same title, Shake Hands with the Devil. But the film is actually a very good movie too. So if you get your hands on it, it's well worth watching. So that is a bigger picture of the Canadian peacekeeping tradition, and it's a very proud one. If you look at the history of Canadians contributing, you'll see that we've contributed many force commanders over the years. Now, what exactly is peacekeeping? It's the deployment of international military, police, and civilian personnel to a conflict area with the consent of the main parties. So this is not an invasion force. This is consensual. And you're acting impartially. That is, you're not there to support one party over the other. You're there to carry out impartially, like a police would be on the street. They're not favoring one gang versus the other. They are there to enforce the law, no matter who's committing the crime. And the roles are to stop or contain hostilities, supervise the carrying out of a peace agreement, and I add here to the UN definition, assist with humanitarian relief, human rights compliance, and nation building. So it's a very multidimensional mandate as it's been expanded over the years. If you look at the types of components in the broader, now we use the term peace operations, as the UN uses peace operations more generally, and Canada continues to use the term peace support operations. We look at peacemaking, which is the negotiation of an agreement between parties so that they can have a sustainable peace. Peace building is creating infrastructure, whether it be the sewers or the libraries, the economic building. It's to create the infrastructure for a sustainable peace. So those people there are not taking hammers against each other. They're actually constructing something together in the stick figures that we have there. The UN would also engage in humanitarian assistance, providing the necessary supplies for people to be sustained during the conflict so that they can live to see a better day and that they can live a life afterwards, and also be free from the economic effects of war, manage to live freer lives, because otherwise the war would make it impossible for them to sustain themselves. And then peacekeeping is a part of that larger peace support operation picture where you're there for the security, creating security in the region. Could be through buffer zones, could be through a ceasefire line, supervision, could be monitoring, could actually be, moving on to enforcement. So we'll go on to the last category, that the peacekeepers sometimes use force if the red line is being crossed many times after many warnings and one party is recalcitrant and not living up to the peace agreement. Then the UN may need to use force in addition to its own self-defense. They can use force to enforce a peace. So the parties have agreed to the peace, and there you're just making sure that the parties don't attack civilians and are abiding by the agreement. Otherwise, and so a very short-term action. And unlike in traditional military operations where you have an enemy, and that party stays an enemy, as soon as the UN has done its enforcement action, it brings the parties back to the negotiating table and negotiates with them, talks to them, continuous dialogue, even when you're taking military action against the party that's violating a ceasefire or shooting at civilians. And I look at the history of peacekeeping, which is one of my passions, and see the evolution over time from the early observer missions in Kashmir and in the Middle East to interposed forces, which is Pierce's 1956 proposal, and then interposition was used much more, to multidimensional missions at the end of the Cold War. There was this idea of bringing much more of police forces and civilians. You're doing election monitoring, doing that variety of activities that I showed under peace operations. And then the UN in the turn of the century also made some major jumps in roles to transitional administrations where they actually governed territories. That is in Kosovo in 1999 and in East Timor in 1999. So the UN actually was responsible for the entire governance of a territory temporarily until the locals could get enough power to and skill to be able to run their own affairs. And so we saw East Timor go until 2002, and Kosovo, there was a unilateral declaration in 2006. And there's still a presence, UN presence in Kosovo, but it's much reduced, of course, from the time when it was actually governing the territory. And in each of these stages, there was solid Canadian leadership. The first observer mission of the Security Council was actually in Kashmir, but it took a while to deploy. But the first chief military observer, the first head of that mission was a Canadian, Harry Engel, but he died in a plane crash in the Himalayas. In the interposed force, the first force commander was Tommy Burns. So we had first there. In multidimensional missions, we had 9 force commanders in the 1990s alone. So there were 9 commanders of UN missions and forces and other missions under peacekeeping in the 1990s. And transitional administrations, we had major roles in that as well. So in this multidimensional missions, we have the political, trying to get people to negotiate and talk. You have the military component, and I've spoke about the Canadian role in there. But we also had a large component in humanitarian relief. And there I've met in the field. I've been to a half dozen peacekeeping operations, probably on a dozen occasions. And you meet Canadians in there, and those Canadians are not sent by the government. The civilians are actually individually hired by the UN. So we were very well represented in UN peace operations. There's many Canadians there because Canadians gravitate towards that type of work. And we had major contributions in policing. We had the chief of the police section in Haiti was Canadian for the entire duration of the MINUSTA mission from 2004 to 2017. And we even continued with the head of the police, subsequent police mission afterwards was also Canadian. And we had roles in judicial matters. I remember coming back from Europe one time and sat next to a man who was coming back from Kosovo. And he said his role was to make sure that the judges did not make rulings based on ethnicity. That if a Kosovar judge didn't do an unfair judgment against a Serb, and similarly a Serb judge would not take punitive action based on ethnicity for a Kosovar. So the UN had a supervising role in that aspect. And then there's many activities to make the social atmosphere better, so that people who were formerly shooting each other could now come to the negotiating table and talk with each other and actually work with each other and help reconstruct our society with businesses that could operate in larger sphere, not just based on ethnic groups and warlords who are only dedicated to their own ethnic or conflicting group. And that's part of the larger economic rebuilding that then brings in other UN agencies, including the UN Development Program. Here's a few pictures from Haiti with the police officers deployed. I was talking about the generals who were prominent in peacekeeping, from Cyprus mission to the Central America mission to Rwanda with 2 generals there, to the multinational force in Eastern Zaire, to Haiti, and then in UNDOF, which is the mission in the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. So we had these really illustrious appointments and excellent service in the field, but unfortunately we haven't had a Canadian general appointed as head of a mission in peacekeeping since the turn of the century. A quarter century has passed, and Canada has been not contributing many troops, but also not really coming forward with with proposals for officers who could lead. In 2017, the UN waited 2 months for Canada to put forward a candidate, and eventually a cabinet decision was made not to put forward the candidate. And I know the soldiers, the generals and colonel who were going to be deployed should the name go forward, but then we backed down. So it was a big disappointment. We could have led the Mali mission in 2017, 2018. So being a scientist by background, I like graphs and I like to quantify things that can be quantified. Here's the contributions of forces. If you look in 1950, we had very few in peacekeeping, and peacekeeping was very small then, but it increased largely because of UNEF in 1956, and we went to more than 1,000 military personnel deployed in peacekeeping. When Cyprus mission was created with Canadian help with Paul Martin Sr. In 1964, the number increased to 2,500. In the 1970s, it was around 2,000 at its peak, and at all these points, you'll see roughly 1,000 or more deployed until the turn of the century. We had a maximum of 3,300 in Somalia, Cambodia, and Bosnia in those missions in the 1992-93. And then went down in 2000. We had a slight peak in Ethiopia, Eritrea, with a force in 2001, 2002. We went up in MINUSTA with a small deployment to help with the Americans when they had ousted Aristide, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, from Haiti, and we re-had it into UN forces. And then we had a variety of missions, but you can see we've dipped down now to, there's just 20 military personnel and about 10 police currently in peacekeeping. Certainly there were difficult situations, and to put our Canadian personnel in difficult situations, we had the embarrassments of Canadian soldiers who committed torture in the airborne regiment of a Somali teenager, Shadil Aron. And General Dallaire had to witness the genocide and also became suicidal himself as a result of the nightmares of that, but managed to overcome all those tendencies and now, became a thriving senator. I'm glad that Senator Roche is with us today, and he had Romeo Dallaire as a colleague. And then we have my friend Patrick Reckner, who was chained to a lightning rod to act as a human shield against NATO forces if they were going to take action against the Serbs. So he was released after 2 weeks, and NATO did take action, and it actually helped bring about the accords that ended the war in Bosnia, and it actually created a remarkable peace. When I remember in those days, there was a feeling that those people could never live together in peace. But it has happened since 1995, December 95, that we had the Dayton Peace Accords, and Bosnia has been at peace. I mean, it's a rough peace, and it's the communities still don't get along well, but they're not in the wartime mode that they once were. And the UN learned the lesson that there are times when you need to have robust forces, and one of the big symbols, the poster child for robust peacekeeping, is the Mi-24 helicopter, which was seen as a fearsome tank buster during the Cold War, produced in Ukraine and Russia. But then it was painted white and then became a symbol of peace and peace enforcement, deployed in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in the Congo, in Cote d'Ivoire, and it took very important action against rebel groups who were committing atrocities against civilians. So quite a symbol of change. For your organization, we can definitely call it a sword into a plowshare. It still had a sharp edge, but there's no way that in war you would actually paint your helicopter white. That was part of the show of presence that the UN wanted to have, like it does with its vehicles, paints them white. So I said I wanted to show how successful peacekeeping has been, and it actually has helped Canadian security. So I'll start from the left side. In Central America in the 1980s, there were so many civil wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and those wars were solved through negotiations, through the Escopulas II agreement with Oscar Arias, and through the deployment of peacekeepers in these different countries. And they part of the transition to peace. So very important to have seen peace brought to Central America through the UN efforts. It was the UN Secretary General. They actually extended his time in office. They diplomatically stopped the clock so he could be there for the signing of the agreements in El Salvador because he had played such an important role in getting the parties to agreement. We had missions in Dominican Republic and, of course, in Haiti. And a big mistake was made that the MINUSTA mission, and here these pictures are of 20th century missions, but there was a mission from 2004 till 2017. And unfortunately, it was withdrawn. And then we saw the gangs gain control of Haiti afterwards. So it was a mistake. It's one of the indications that peacekeeping works when it's withdrawn prematurely, that the conflicting parties can come to the fore. And moving over to Africa, we saw missions that keep a stable peace in Western Sahara, and the MINURSO mission, even though there's no resolution to that problem. But the peacekeeping is good, it's keeping of the peace, but the peacemaking is being deficient because primarily the Moroccans do not want to give territory to the Sahrawi people who had traditionally been in that land. When you move further down in Africa, you can see missions in Sierra Leone, where you had the RUF cutting off people's limbs, and the UN using those attack helicopters to help defeat the RUF. And they came to the negotiating table, and the Sierra Leone is at peace compared to what it was in the 1990s, thanks to the presence of UN peacekeepers. Similarly, in Liberia, we saw the end of a civil war there with the help of UNMIL, the UN mission in Liberia. Then, if I continue to look in Africa, we saw the birth of a new nation, UNTAG, where in Namibia, where the UN Secretary General actually inaugurated the first president of Namibia. So it was an action by the United Nations, a peacekeeping force, that was able to oversee the South African withdrawal, the elections that were held there. There were major contribution of Canadian police, and the Namibians were able to have their first chance to vote freely in election and determine their future, including electing their first president. Angola was a very difficult mission. There were successes in elections, but in the end, the rebel groups by Joseph Savimbi decided to rebel again. And so we didn't actually have a stable peace there until the end of the Cold War and a few years later. I just continue on. We saw end of civil war in Onamuz, and that's Mozambique. We saw the mission in UNAMIR, which was ill-prepared for the genocide, but still had major accomplishment of being able to save people during the genocide. We had missions in Somalia and a premature withdrawal based on Bill Clinton's decision after 18 Marines were killed in a separate operation that was not UN operation. But when the US withdrew, then there was very little support to continue there. And we see the havoc in Somalia to this day because the peacekeepers did not stay in that country. Moving to the Middle East, we've seen successful operations to deal between Israel and Egypt. The Middle East would be very different today if Egypt were at war or would go to war and break the Treaty of 1979, which was helped by peacekeepers. And it would have been a UN mission. Now it's a US-led mission called Multinational Force and Observers that oversees that border between Egypt and Israel. And we still have UNSO, that first peacekeeping mission from 1948 in the Middle East. We saw peace coming out in Bosnia and Croatia and in Macedonia, a preventive deployment. It's called UNPREDEP, UN Preventive Deployment Force. We saw missions in Eastern Slavonia, Privlaka, and Kosovo. So these are all very important missions to create stability. We saw the mission in UNIFIL, which is now a major set of eyes and ears of the international community as Israel conducts its aggression and Hezbollah fires on Israel. So there's important to have eyes and ears there. But unfortunately, in the current environment, the UNIFIL mission is due to withdraw at the end of this year. So I'm giving you ideas. I'll just briefly go over to Asia. I myself was deployed on the mission in East Timor in 1999, and I was there under Indonesian occupation. But the UN, after some very difficult times, a reign of terror by the militias, and I lost a member of my team, and I myself was called a spy, and I'm told my security could not be guaranteed. But that mission was successful, thanks in part to Australian intervention in another peacekeeping force, Interfet, and that saw the birth of a new nation. So I was so happy to see at military conferences when East Timorese soldiers are now contributing to peacekeeping. That's the view of the map. I'll just give you one story to make it very concrete. The MINUSTA mission in Haiti, from 2004, had the mandate to do secure and stable environment, human rights, and political process. And it was it had huge challenges in Haiti. And one of them was that this particular building on Route Nationale Numéro 1 between the airport and the port was used by the militias to extract bribes from all the cars and traffic going past that house. And I went into that house after it was liberated from the militias with the force commander, and I learned the story that how he had done it. He created a feint in another direction. The militiamen went out of the house. Then the Brazilian soldiers came into the house, and the Canadian, who was deputy police commissioner in Haiti at the time of the mission, he told me he never saw soldiers sandbagging so fast. Within 15 minutes, they had that entire place sandbagged. So when the militia came back and saw that the UN was occupying, they started firing at the UN, and then the UN could fire back in self-defense. But they were well protected inside that building, the Blue House. There was an operation that lasted about 14 hours. They had to pause in the middle of it when the Red Cross asked for ability to go in and retrieve any bodies that were there, but it saw the defeat of the militia. The House of Cards fell, and the territory was given back to the Haitian police, which they were not able to actually send any police officers in that neighborhood for years because the police were not welcome there. But now you could see the Secretary General's Special Envoy, Hedi Nabi. He accompanied by the force commander on his right, and the forces there being able to regain the territory through the forceful action, Brazilian-led, and we need something like that today to deal with the gangs once more, Brazilian-Canadian cooperation. So what did Canada do in peacekeeping? Well, in the Monk debate of 2015, Lloyd Exworthy told me that he was advising Trudeau prior to that, and Trudeau said that the fact that Canada has nothing to contribute to that conversation in New York, that is, President Obama was chairing a meeting, how you can contribute to peacekeeping. The candidate Trudeau, Liberal leader, said that it's disappointing because this is something that a Canadian Prime Minister started, and right now there's a need to revitalize, refocus, and support peacekeeping operations. So a lot of hope with the election and campaign promises that Canada would re-engage, and also the U.S. was pushing us to re-engage. So it would meet both the realist objectives of working with the United States and also the liberal and idealist objectives of helping the UN. So Canada did pledge in 2016 up to 600 troops, 150 police, and a substantial amount of money through peace ops in global affairs to support peacekeeping. But we pledged up to 600 troops. We never made at any one point even half that. Police, we didn't even make 1/5 of that. And the term up to is a fudge factor, as it turns out, that we could always say we fulfilled our promise because even zero would be up to 600 troops. We did have a big conference in Vancouver. It was a moment where the defense ministers of the world came to Vancouver, and it was great for promotion of the idea of peacekeeping. And we made pledges, including the ELSI initiative to promote women in peacekeeping. But unfortunately, we ourselves have no women in peacekeeping now. So it's a poor example that Canada is setting. We proposed innovative training, but there are training tools that Canada is not providing to the UN that we actually developed here in Canada. I myself was part of it. And for some reason, we just are not moving forward with that promise of innovative training. And we are unfortunately not taking advantage of the receptivity to Canadians, historical contributions, and receptivity to having Canada help out in this area, because it's amazing how long a reputation lasts beyond when the reputation was earned. So we promised a tactical airlift support, which we did provide. That's a check mark. Aviation task force, briefly in Mali. Quick reaction force, never provided. And new police mission being examined. Well, that's not much of a promise, because you just say you're going to examine the possibility, but we didn't carry it out. So these are the RCF sends for 15 days every 3 months a Hercules aircraft to Africa, based in Entebbe, and does multi-mission support. And this is the crew that's supporting with the yellow UN workers as well. And I'm proud that some of my students today at the college were pilots and navigators for that service to the UN, and that's continued. So it's been more than 6 years now since we kind of provided that. But it's only 15 days every 3 months. That's an average of 5 days a month. And it's we don't go into dangerous areas. So we were very careful to stay out of any risky areas and do some of the heavy lifting in Africa. Well, we did the heavy lifting with the aircraft, but not with our personnel. So where are peacekeepers today? You'll see that the UN has peacekeepers deployed still in Western Sahara and Kosovo and Cyprus. Canada has one person in Cyprus in that mission. In Lebanon, the UN has a mission which is really, it loses people every month now because of the aggression being committed there. There's a small mission, 15 military observers in India, Pakistan. As I mentioned, we were the first head of that mission back when it was created. Central African Republic has a MINUSCA mission, very important for the stability in that country, especially as Wagner Group tries to get more and more influence there. It's important that the West be there to have some sort of eyes and ears on what the Russian, now called Africa Corps, is doing to subvert democracy and to gain exploitation of mineral resources. Big mission in MONUSCO, and that mission is for the Democratic Republic of Congo, very important in East Africa, in Eastern Congo, I should say. I call it the wild east of the Congo, where there's still militias that are rampant, and indeed they control two of the biggest towns in the Kivus, Goma and Bukavu. South Sudan, the world's newest country, it was only born in 2011. And it saw a mission there, but unfortunately the leaders couldn't get along, and we saw a civil war in that country. But very important that the UN be there and try and do what it can, even in the midst of violence. And Abyei, which is a territory which has not yet decided its own future, and there's still a debate going on to whether Abyei can be joined with South Sudan or become its own country, and there's issues about whether the transmigrant workers and the farmers and the herders, who can actually vote in that election to determine whether it becomes a country. And so that's held up the problem, because some people are only there temporarily, and do they have a right to vote? That's still subject of heated debate between the communities. And UNDOF in the Middle East. So we see that there is valuable peacekeeping presence, but this is such a good idea, and unfortunately, it's not being deployed as much as it should. So if you look at this graph of the number of peacekeepers, it went 10,000 was typical during the Cold War, of which Canada provided at least 1,000. Then in the 1990s, we went up to almost 80,000. Then the UN went down as there were less demand for peacekeepers, but then a huge demand with Congo operations and in Africa in the 2000s, and reached the peak of 104,000 uniformed personnel, that's military and police, in 2015. And then after Trump was elected in 2016, wanted to cut the budget, there was no appetite to create new missions and a lot of pressure to reduce costs. So the number of peacekeepers has gone down now to around 60,000 uniformed personnel and another 10,000 or so civilians. What about Canada? Well, under Paul Martin, we still had, up till 2006, around over 300, because we had logisticians in the mission in the Golan Heights, and it was withdrawn during the Harper period. We're brought down to 150, and the blue is the police, the green is the military, and the blue is high for most of this period because of Haiti mission. There were a large number of police, typically 100 police, were deployed in Haiti for long periods of time. And then we saw Trudeau fils, as opposed to Trudeau père, come in power in 2015. And it was a promise for increase. So we were hoping to go back at least to where it was under Martin, and maybe even go back to the days when we were a major contributor with over 1,000 peacekeepers. But the only thing that was done was that one spike in Mali for the year-long mission in MINUSMA. And then we saw that Canada reach historic lows, where we had so few peacekeepers that we hadn't had that since the creation of the first peacekeeping force in 1956. So quite disappointing. Our rank was number 1 in terms of number of contributions of uniformed personnel, and now we're typically in the 70th or so of contributors to UN peacekeeping. I mentioned some of the missions here where we're deployed: 14 in Congo, 2 in Cyprus, 1 or 2 now, Kosovo 1, South Sudan 10, Middle East 5. So you see that the military is around 23, the police around 9. So we're not contributing that many. We do have a major push on women, peace, and security. There's a lot of creative work being done in that area, but again, we're not living up to practicing what we preach. So we have a presence in New York. I'm always happy to wander the halls of the UN and meet Canadians there. The outgoing head of the Department of Safety and Security is a Canadian, former RCMP officer, and Canadians are well represented in the UN Secretariat. So I'm going to come to the conclusion now with a quote from Lester Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize speech. It's, "We made at least a beginning then. If on that foundation we don't build something more permanent and stronger, we will once again have ignored realities, rejected opportunities, and betrayed our trust." Well, we did a lot since 1957. Canada was for decades contributing. We did build something stronger, a better foundation, but I can't say that we've continued with that now. It's much reduced from what it was during the Cold War. Still, Canada remains a respected middle power. It has this distinguished peacekeeping history. It doesn't have the colonial baggage that some of the larger countries have, yet we're one of the bigger economies in the world, top 15 economies, and we have a long history of supporting the rule of law, and an example within our own country of relatively corruption-free government and respect for the police. And we actually have people that I work with every day, the Canadian Armed Forces and the police forces, who are multicultural, bilingual, capable members, well-trained, not for peacekeeping, because we don't do specific peacekeeping training, but well-trained as general personnel, military and police personnel, which could be deployed when called upon. When Anita Anand went before the General Assembly, in last General Assembly, the last General Assembly, when they have their annual meeting in September, the high-level panels, she was talking about Canada. She said, from promoting peacekeeping operations during the Suez Crisis to spearheading the Ottawa Treaty, that's 1997 under Lloyd Axworthy, Canada has consistently been an innovative leader. Well, I mean, those examples are from 1956 and 1997. Those are from the previous century. So I don't know that you can actually insert the word consistently on that, but it's hopefully that spirit does continue to guide them today. And in Haiti, the U.S. was leaning on us heavily to deploy military forces to help suppress the gangs, but the Chief of Defense Staff made a big effort to try and prevent that. I just spoke to Bob Ray when he was coming to teach my class a few weeks ago, and he told me about how the Chief of Defense Staff was advocating that Canada not contribute to a UN force in Haiti. Chief of Defense Staff Wayne Eyre had advocated what the CDS called strategic patience. In other words, just wait this out. and don't take action while there's massive atrocities being committed in Haiti. Unfortunately, the Haiti situation is not much improved. We don't yet have leaders like Brazil or Canada that are willing to come forward to help resolve that horrible situation in our hemisphere. I can look around in the world today, and in a very difficult world, we have, lots of opportunities for peacekeeping forces, if only there was political will to help create them. And even today, in the Persian or Arabian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, there is a need for a force to go in and do demining. And I think that West European countries are waiting until there's a ceasefire, and then they might go in and do demining. They may actually do naval peacekeeping, something new in history, whereby we keep the ceasefire between two naval parties, that is the Iran and the United States and Israel, and we would then have escorts through difficult zones. We could have the building of the area so that it's free of sea mines. You could have communications and form of facilitation between the forces and the navies that are operating that area, so that there's some level of cooperation. If they don't want to talk to each other directly, they can do it through the UN. I see a huge need in Gaza, as there's rebuilding is desperately needed for the Palestinian people. And we need a stabilization force, and it can't be one that's a commercial force like the one that was in there temporarily under U.S. proposal or under President Trump's Board of Peace. There's an idea, but it's all very fanciful, and with countries that have very little experience, and it's not even acceptable to the Palestinians. So it's the UNRWA, which had done so much for the Palestinians over the decades, that needs to be strengthened, and there needs to be an international force with UN blessing. Indonesia has pledged 10,000 troops, and it would be good to take Indonesia up on that offer, although it withdrew that offer when the United States attacked Iran. In Ukraine, I see the need for peacekeeping forces once there's a ceasefire. There actually was a ceasefire a week ago, a week or a little more than that, when during the Orthodox Easter, where the two sides did do prisoner exchange and the level of firing went way down. But when there's a longer ceasefire, there'll be need for observation of who fired in the ceasefire and that it's being maintained. It was also needed for rebuilding of Ukraine, for mediation between Ukraine and Russia. And so I really see that we could have a big role in helping resolve the Ukraine crisis, and even putting in some observers now. It may not be welcomed by Russia, but we could have gaining experience in that territory to at least do the observation about what small steps are being taken and what local dialogue is being done between the fighting parties. Sudan is arguably the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in the world today. It desperately needs a peacekeeping force. And there have been successful peacekeeping forces before in Darfur and South Sudan. There was an UNMISS mission in Sudan to help oversee the independence of South Sudan. And so there's a big need there for peacekeeping force that can support humanitarians going in and providing that aid. I see in Syria and the Golan Heights the mission needs to be increased, and even internally within the country of Syria, it got its liberation from a dictatorship, and there's lots of problems in Syria that we don't see, but we could really use an international presence there in order to observe the violations that are being done by various countries, including Israel, on Syrian territory. And so a peacekeeping mission would be very valuable. I see them being valuable in Myanmar for the civil war there, for the Philippines. There's a Moro fighting force there. Could be peacekeepers deployed there. Could even in the South China Sea if we're going to do naval peacekeeping. Libya, we should have had a major peacekeeping operation after the NATO operation in 2011, but the United States didn't want to stay involved, just left the Libyans, and they broke up into small groups. and then between Azerbaijan and Armenia, needing for a legitimate force, not the Russians who call themselves peacekeepers there. So, my friends, I'm coming to my end here. That peacekeeping is a continuing adventure. As you can see, there's just so many areas where peacekeeping can be applied, so many utilities for peacekeeping, and a very illustrious Canadian history of contributions to peacekeeping, and a good hope that sometime in the future we might once again become a prolific contributor to peacekeeping operations. It is a chance for a safer world that we should seize. And that's the world we want to live in. We want to move towards that. And on Earth Day 2026, I'm very happy that you invited me to share this view of the globe, not only from outer space, but also globally thinking, that we find global solutions for these global problems, and that we have stronger global organizations backed by military forces.
The journey to the history of Canadian peacekeeping. I personally learned a lot about that. So for me, I have a question about how the sea peacekeeping training is different from what Canadian forces are presenting or doing right now.
Yeah, so peacekeeping is quite different from war fighting, and it's quite different from counterinsurgency. So right now we're pivoting from COING, which we did in Afghanistan. COING is counterinsurgency, to great power competition and thinking of fighting with China or with Russia. So first of all, a comparison with the COING. In peacekeeping, you have three basic principles. The first is that you are there with consent of the parties. Second, that you act impartially. Third, that you use minimum amount of force only in self-defense or defensive mandate. That's defensive use of force. If you look at counterinsurgency operations, it's not consensual. The enemy are the insurgents. So you are fighting the insurgents. You're not impartial, and you could use offensive operations, as we did many times in Afghanistan. So the difference is very stark between those types of operations, and requires a different mindset, requires a different set of skills, involves a lot more of mediation, facilitation between conflicting parties. It means courage to stand between groups that want to fight and shoot against each other, and you're standing in the middle, preventing them from fighting. So it's a different skill set, and we do not train our soldiers, aviators, and sailors in this field basically at all. I mean, I've had so many of them say they never had training like this during their career. So it's too bad, because it's a valuable skill, and there could be great need for it.
For an excellent presentation. I really appreciate your tenacity. I admire it so much. I guess my thought is, like, the aspirations of 1957 and the expectations and the hopes for Canada having a vital peacekeeping role in the world, and Pearson's dreams, etc. But I just wanted to know from your perspective. From my perspective, the geopolitical, as you mentioned, there has to be agreement first between the parties that they want peace, and then there's a role for Canadian peacekeeping forces. But it seems to me that the geopolitical circumstances have changed, and it seems to me like there are agreements made, but then they fall apart. There were agreements between Russia and Ukraine, they fell apart. And so much of that had to do with intervention, particularly by the U.S. military, the audacity of the U.S. military to intervene, and as an aggressor has escalated since 1957. So I just wanted to get your thought. I mean, that's my perception, but just wanted to get your thoughts on the changes in the geopolitical landscape that have to do with peacekeeping roles not meeting the aspirations and expectations from 1957.
Yeah, first of all, peacekeeping is a very frustrating type of activity. And we have to realize that being a peacekeeper means that often it's not the two sides love you, but the two sides see you as being unfair because you're not taking their side. They see themselves as the victim, and they want to be able to go against the other side and have some military victory. So internally, they may be happy that you're there, that you're preventing the fighting, but they'll be complaining externally about your presence there as a peacekeeper in many cases. I mean, the majority of the populations don't want to see war, but the parties themselves will continue to have grievance until that's resolved at a much deeper level, and that's a long-term process. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to see peacekeeping not in terms of wars, which should usually last months or years, but peacekeeping is decades-long activity. So we need to have a commitment to helping the UN for decades. Like in places like Haiti, you just can't expect that it's going to be resolved in a matter of a decade or two. We need to do a long-term commitment, and in some cases actually take over important functions so that the government can get back on its feet before it can govern in the territories which were previously militia-led. So patience is really required. That's another thing that's very different from war fighting in the sense that you have to be there for long term, and the military is always looking for the exit strategy. But in some cases, what the military likes to call military creep, which is something that is not the military doesn't like, is actually mission reality. So mission creep is mission reality, and you need to go with the changing circumstances. And peace building is just so much more difficult than war destruction. So war destruction, it's very easy to destroy something. It takes a long time to get people to cooperate. They can go to become angry very easily, but to get them to work with each other after they've been angry is a difficult process. So, I'm really grateful to all the peacekeepers, Canadian and others, who went to these war zones and put their lives in danger in order to help bring peace to some of the most difficult spots of the world.
Thank you. I think Doug is next. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Thank you for your outstanding presentation tonight. I'd like to draw you out a bit more on Canada's role in a very chaotic world today. It seems to me that not only has the number of Canadian troops and Canadian military people declined to virtually zero, as you pointed out, not only has the number fallen down, but I think that there is, within the leadership of the Canadian Armed Forces, and even what I would describe as a hostility toward peacekeeping. And there's no incentive, no drive forward to do this. And I put this question to you in the context of Prime Minister Carney greatly increasing the budget for defense and for our contribution to NATO is well known now. We're going up to if we go to 5% of GDP, it'll be $150 billion a year. And it's an astounding amount of money that is being spent. And so, what would be your thought or your advice on how we could incentivize the government and by extension the military to return to Canada's role in peacekeeping? I think that there's a great need in the world, and we need to turn around the viewpoint of the government of Canada. And in my own case, and I do a lot of writing for the Hill Times, and I mean, I'd be glad to write about this if I could just get focused on how to move the Canadian establishment thinking to return to vigorous peacekeeping.
Oh, thanks so much, Doug, and always appreciate your voice being there in favor of peace for all these decades. And it'd be a great idea if you were to write something about peacekeeping for the Hill Times. I have to say that the military itself finds itself overwhelmed with the number of tasks. I had a chance to speak with the Chief of Defense Staff, and I said, how about Canada doing more in peacekeeping? And she very frankly said no. that we were now concerned about our southern border, about our Arctic, about the Indo-Pacific strategy, about Ukraine. And so they see this as being something that would take away from the priorities that are more immediate. So we're always trying to deal with the most immediate threat. And so not looking to longer term. Of course, if we were doing peacekeeping, I argue that we can actually cause some of the problems that will become our major preoccupation in the future to be resolved early on. For instance, if the UN had stayed on in Afghanistan in the early 1990s, we might not have had to go back there in 2001. And it's just these areas of the world, they can acquire importance and we don't recognize it beforehand. And all of a sudden we have a 10-year commitment to combat in Afghanistan. The world is so interconnected that we really have to be trying to make efforts in all these regions before the regions come back to haunt us. And could be that conflict regions are the cause of new pandemics. We've almost got rid of certain diseases, but we're just waiting for some conflict areas to settle down so that we can do the necessary vaccinations. There's so many reasons that we should actually deploy and go out there. But I don't see that Canada wants to take the lead. It's much more of a follower in the military mentality. And there was a whole bunch of factors that contributed towards the Canadian military souring on peacekeeping. Now, that doesn't mean everyone. I have lots of soldiers who want to deploy, soldiers who and sailors and aviators who take my courses in order to learn more about peacekeeping. But at the same time, it's very much the leadership doesn't want those extra tasks. And I think there's resistance. I wouldn't say hostility, but resistance to taking on extra tasks. If they have these things they got to do, and then there's one more set, and learning the ins and outs of the UN, which we were superb at for one time. We really did have people who really knew how to work within the UN system, the logistics and leadership and communications. But now we've lost that skill. So then people are kind of like, oh, we go into that. We go with lots of unknowns. So the way to overcome the military resistance is through political will, but there isn't sufficient political will to overcome the military resistance. But there are some opportunities. For instance, Ali Assasi is interested in circulating a letter to revive the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. The peace train is coming to Ottawa again in October. We'll see them when the Canadian Network for Abolition of Nuclear Weapons and the other Canadian Pugwash organizations meet. So the peace train folks will be with us again this year. And they're also pushing for a Center for Peace and Justice. So I see lots of opportunities for us to voice, but how to make it heard, I don't know. Ali Assasi wants to write a letter among MPs, and he's asked me to write it, and I've been procrastinating. But maybe with a bit of encouragement from you, I would do it. But I'm just not sure how much another letter would make a difference. I mean, it's important to do that, but if I ever really saw it was a good chance that it would cause effect. I did speak with the Minister of National Defense about creating a Pearson Peacekeeping Center, and he was enthusiastic about it. So there's something to build on there, but I can see that there'd be resistance to the idea within DND.
Tatiana, and thanks, Walter, for the presentation. That was a lot. It was a lot to think about, the history of Canada with peacekeeping and the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And it seems like we're maybe in some ugly parts right now. When I think about polarization, and I think that's where I'm going. I mean, we can't even get people talking to each other in Canada, and we can't get America and Canada talking to each other. And so the idea of peacekeeping at this point is just really interesting. And I guess where I see possibility always is for changes on the ground with people in Canada, understanding that I think more people want us talking to each other, internationally, but also within the country. There's a lot of, I mean, we're in Alberta, right? We're dealing with movement for separation right now. We talk about the importance of talking to each other and having uncomfortable conversations or conversations that stretch us a little bit. So my question really was around the work of peacekeeping, and you talked a little bit about going into areas where people didn't, both sides didn't really like you because you weren't taking sides. I think I caught that correctly, especially for the leaders and so forth. And I'm just really curious about that, that idea, because I think that can be very challenging and it's not about people liking you, but are they respecting you being there and doing the work that you're doing? And I'm sure it's different in every situation, but I'm just curious about that. And then it kind of in the backdrop of what we're dealing with in polarization. Can throw in some ideas around that. Thanks a lot.
I think those two questions are really related. One of the models that I teach in my peacekeeping course is to look at a conflict between two parties, A and B. And there's a line between them. And on the extremes are the extremist A and extremist B. And they are explicit enemies. They like to hate each other and blame each other. But they're implicit allies because they polarize their communities towards themselves so that they can use the opponent to be able to demonize the opponent and then say, well, I'm the one who's saving you, my community. Whereas in the middle, there's a huge, vast number of people who want to get along. They're the moderates or the larger population. And they say, let's just overcome these problems so that we can do trade, we can do lots of agreements, we can travel more freely, we can live our lives safely. And the vast majority are people like that. So just being able to prevent the extremists from polarizing is one of the tasks, whether it be within Canada or whether it be internationally. And one of the things that peacekeepers do is that they help create space for the moderates. So the extremists have to recognize that they're dependent in part on peacekeepers because otherwise even their own physical security wouldn't be so strong. They need the peacekeepers for the financial support that comes into their community and for the activities that the peacekeepers do. So they may resent the peacekeepers because they're holding them back from fighting the enemy. But at the same time, they appreciate the peacekeepers are playing a role to moderate what's going on. But the extremists don't want to end the conflict, and peacekeepers are there to help find a solution, to help reconciliation. That's where the peacemaking part comes in. And so dealing with those extremists and not giving them power is really the trick to peacekeeping. But it's so hard because they have their own pull. They can often use hate, which is such a strong human emotion, unfortunately. And the power of love is more enduring, but hate grabs people quicker and makes them do rash things that then creates what they call the vicious cycle of retribution. And what we want to do is use love to create a virtuous cycle in the opposite direction. So one goodwill gesture leads to another, and we lead to a better world. And peacekeepers can help that virtuous cycle, but it's very time-consuming. Very takes a huge amount of patience, and you don't get success all the time. It's not always successful. It's still the right thing to do, but it requires a lot of courage.
I do have actually two questions. Let me ask the general one first, if I can get it in or get two in. You listed a whole great number of places where peacekeeping could be needed. Do you have any personal preference? Which one would you recommend? Where we could focus our energies if Canada got involved again?
Right. So for Canada, I really think that Haiti is a calling. We have a huge amount of experience there. We're bilingual. It's a francophone country, or if you want to say with Creole, it's francophone related. We actually have a large Haitian migrant population in Canada, and it's something that the U.S. would really appreciate if we could deal with it. Even the Trump administration would love it if Canada were to help solve that problem, because they don't want the migrants who are coming in who just can't live in Haiti and are desperate to find refuge in the United States. So Haiti would be one area, but it would be very challenging to take on the gangs. and it might result in some firefights, might result in some civilians dying. And so that would require a huge amount of courage. And the politicians would have to provide cover for the military, because the military doesn't want to go in there with that huge risk, and they get blamed for what you can foresee is going to be some body bags coming back. So there has to be some tolerance for that. I mean, it's nothing compared to what you'd see in a war, but it's still substantial. I mean, we've lost 115 in peacekeeping over the time since 1956, or 1950 actually was our first fatality, and that we might see, a dozen more peacekeepers coming back from into Haiti, which would be tragic, and there could be some instances of embarrassment. But at the same time, I find it's really important. I've been to Haiti several times, and I really feel for the Haitian population, and there's no one coming to the rescue.